G'day and welcome everybody to CatalystWest Conversations, our second week in. You loved us so much first time round with Vice Chancellor Barney Glover and Helen Bartram that we're back again. And thanks to everyone that tuned in first time. Thanks also for your comments and your feedback. Today we've upped the technological curve. We're actually going to put some polling questions to you during our discussion. And we'd love your input into those. It's really a mix of some kind of in-depth and philosophical questions, but also some pretty mundane ones and a little touch of dad humour there. So my apologies for that. This week we're going to kick off with some reimagining of what Western Sydney or what our lives can look like more broadly in the recovery and post-COVID phase. There's that word again, and I think that. It's really beholden on us now to, yes, engage with dealing with the crisis, but to also think about what it might look like on the other side. We're very fortunate today to have two wonderful guests to help me take you through that. We've got Joe Carmichael from Arup, who leads their design and planning across New South Wales and the ACT. And we've also got Don Wright, Launchpad startup guru from Western Sydney University. He'll hate that reference, but Don has some angles as well on what it might look like for SMEs and startups in the brave new world we will enter at some stage soon. So I'm going to hand over to you, Don, really to set the scene and take us through the impact on the ground, if you like, of COVID for startups, for SMEs and for business in general.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think it's probably important to say we've got a really good health response. You know, there's a lot of positivity about what's happening, but there's a really serious situation on the ground. You know, we're talking about 800,000 people out of work, you know, 10% drop in GDP. We might have 10% unemployment by June. So, you know, while we've got a great health response happening, I think we don't want to sugarcoat it, you know, to be honest, and we have to understand, you know, what is the impact on the ground. There's obviously lots of impacts we're feeling at home, you know, having to stay home, keep the kids at home, all that sort of stuff. But obviously from an employment point of view, the impact is massive. As I say, we don't want to sugarcoat it. We want to understand what is the baseline we're working from. And then we want to think about, you know, how do we go forward from here? And I think there's lots of really good things happening, lots of good response around PPE and COVID-19 in general. But obviously, as we move from sort of the rapid response phase into the recovery phase, it's about really now starting to understand we can't have a crystal ball. We can't understand what will happen in the future, but we can plan for scenarios. So trying to understand those scenarios for business is really important. You know, what will the recovery look like? Will it be the V, the U, or the L shape for economic recovery? And nobody really knows is the answer. But we certainly have to understand what do those scenarios look like for our business and where do we go from here? And we have to think about that from a regional point of view as well.
Thanks, Don. Joe, it's certainly not business as usual in your space, but that's thrown up all manner of, if you like, left field solutions as well. What kind of reimagining are you taking into account of now that we're in this current phase?
Yeah, it's really interesting because what Don says is right, that you know, we can't sugarcoat this, and we're all in this adjusting and sort of understanding what's going on phase, but it won't be long until we're in an emergence phase. And I think the more that we can try and imagine what may happen in those emergence phases, the better that they're going to be for us. And they're going to be different all over the world. I know that Transport for London have been using agent-based modelling to look at how people may emerge and where there might be hotspots around the city for different agents. And the agents in their model vary from coming across 7 other agents to 10,000. So you can imagine that there are places in London that are much more connected and therefore much greater risk of things going wrong. And I think the more that we can try and inform ourselves of what could be when we come out of this, the more that we can react to it better.
What does it mean for long-term planning? Do we really throw a lot of our assumptions out based on the fact that we've had this radical reinvention of life and the way we interact socially? What do we do over the longer term?
So there's definitely going to be behaviour change that will outlast this emergence phase and the recovery phase. So Even just thinking at an individual level, when you are working from home 5 days a week right now, actually a lot of people have realized that that is possible for office-based staff. And when we come out of this, it could well be 18 months that offices aren't working at full capacity. And I think that there's a culture shift going on. The future of work is very different, which means that the future of our cities is very different. And if a large proportion of the population is working from home for, say, 2-3 days a week, then suburbs are going to be different. The sort of travel patterns that occur during the week are going to be different. We may even see shift patterns in offices as we keep to social distancing for the next 18 months. And then beyond that, who knows? But one thing is for sure, that we are all definitely changed forever. We may well see in the long-term future more of these sorts of events. And I would like to think that the world has learned from this and will continue to learn from this, and we will be able to react faster and better next time. A lot of thinking is going on at the moment around resilience. Resilience is the hot topic. How do we make sure that we react to this better? I was talking the other day to one of my London colleagues who specializes in resilience, and she was saying that normally resilience or events that we have to be resilient to are short and narrow. So they last for a period of time that can be predicted, and they're usually in one geographic location for one specific reason.
So we're set up for a sprint, not a marathon, typically.
That's right, yes. This is long. We really don't know how long. It could be many, many years before we're fully recovered. And it's also global, so it's broad as well. And
I think your comments are proven out in the way that so many of us rapidly responded to this wholesale migration online of all of our activity. Things that were thought to be in the realm of impossibility really occurred over the space of days or weeks. So
I think that's a really important point, Andy. If you look at digital health, for example, we've had this really slow burn of change in the digital health space. And a lot of just that can't happen now, things just go on forever. But what we've seen is basically overnight, this massive change and change at scale. You can now have a telehealth appointment. You now get your prescription emailed through. So those sorts of changes, I think they're really important to look at. And we need to take that to government, because this is how we need to sustain this change going forward. Because, we've been really good at this acute response, but how do we change it to these longer term issues? I think that's a really key thing we need to take out of this.
Is it about adopting principles, really moving forward rather than specifics? Do we say that our planning processes need to be beholden to particular principles rather than too much drill down at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's an expectation as well. So I think government, it's interesting speaking to people in government now, because they say, things are getting approved at just light speed at the moment, which could be good or bad. But, there's obviously there's capacity to be able to do things better and faster. I think our challenge is to try to, if you look at Australia's response compared to some around the world, and there's countries like us, but if you look at the US, where they've had a much more polarized situation in their politics. In Australia, we've had pretty broad unification, I think, so from federal government, state governments, oppositions, everyone's pretty much fallen in line. And I think that's been largely behind our good, the success we've had in our response, where you've seen kind of the opposite in the US, and you've got all the, the tragedy there with the lives lost and all the problems around the PPE. But so I think we've got to have a higher expectation on government to perform better. We need better government.
That really plays into a question we've got online from Claudia Casas, who says that this notion of behavioural change will likely see a reversion back to the old familiar. But how do we ensure that the impact on businesses and government actually translates into new behaviour, particularly around things like infrastructure planning?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because I think there's a tendency for us all to just want to get back to normal. And one of my colleagues, Tim Williams, talks about bouncing forward, not bouncing back. And I really like that as a concept, because when you look at China, for instance, I contacted our Wuhan office a couple of weeks ago, and they've all begun to emerge in China, and congestion is worse than it was prior. They're all being asked to be more productive than they were before, and they're bouncing back. I think we can do it differently, and we've got the time and there's the space to think about it right now, nudging people to behave in a certain way, taking back the space, tactical urbanism right across our cities and right across our environments. to get people to do things differently and do them better going forward. We can lock in some of these benefits.
What is the current circumstances meant for you in terms of behavioural change, Don, in dealing with startups in what was an emerging startup culture in Western Sydney? It didn't have the maturity of other parts of the world. So how have you seen behavioural change amongst that cohort?
Well, it's really interesting. It was a big shock at the start when we lost the ability to be able in the same physical space as people. That was a real challenge. So we've shut both our centres basically at Penrith and Parramatta. So, and that's forced the shift to online. And that's been difficult because you just don't have that physical connection with people. So, but we've adapted really well. We've taken basically 100% of our services online, other than accommodating people in an office. And I have to say, I think for me, the positives have outweighed the negatives in a way. I think from just managing our team point of view, I've got new approaches now. We do a daily catch up today, which I can't understand why I didn't do it before. You know, it seems like such a simple thing, but just catching up every day at 9:30, we all jump online. On Friday, we have show and tell, where you have to show something and tell something about your home life. And I think it's actually brought a new dimension to the way we work. So there's been some replacement for the lost physical experience. But in terms of how the startups have reacted, I think they're pretty much like most of the rest of the community. It's been a good positive response, but there's some pain. A lot of issues around investment. So people getting investment deferred, lost investment, just loss of confidence in the ability to go forward, I think is a big challenge. But we're seeing a lot of really great pivoting of businesses within SMEs as well, not just startups, just taking your business online, looking at new products and services. There's a really interesting part of the economy which has got a great growth opportunity. So if you're lucky enough to be in the health space or in some other areas, you're doing really well. So it's not all doom and gloom from that point of view. We've adapted how we're supporting business. So we've just launched a new program today, actually, Innovating through Adversity. So we're trying to work with businesses to focus on the innovation and say, right, we know times are tough, but wherever you sit at the moment, whether you've been marginally affected or severely affected, let's look at how we can respond by doing things differently and more creatively. And I think there's a really great response from people when you start to talk to them in those terms, where they can see a way out or a possible way out, rather because a lot of people in the business community are in serious doom and gloom at the moment.
Well, that's what I think is coming through, and it's really interesting on the polling. We've got 76% of people think that there'll be a profound impact, a 3 to 5 year recovery timeframe as well. But it's relatively optimistic given the scenarios we could be in. That leads me to a really good question from Erica Pauly online. She asks about what do we want to keep from the old business as usual model, and what do we want to keep from the pandemic response? If we're baking a cake, which parts of pre-COVID and current COVID do we take on board with us as we go forward? Jo, I'll throw to you first.
I think there's some very human things around the sort of levels of connection and kindness that I think we've seen in the community in recent months. We are all looking out for each other, and I think we can bring that into the business world. So if things are going to be tough for the next 3 to 5 years, then I think big business needs to think about SMEs and where we can partner and where we can encourage, because we all need each other. And I think there's been that sort of realization. I think there's also a reduction in a materialistic mindset, I think, that has happened. I'd like to retain that, and I'd like to make our cities stronger around things like arts and culture rather than just retail. So I think the human response will last, and that will drive some of the changes in what we see in our physical environment around us.
Love to see kindness become one of those principles that we adopt in a really in-depth and serious way. Don, that touches on your points about consumerism and consumer behaviour driving significant change in the way we do everything going forward. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was reading a report yesterday. It talks about contactless everything, So I mean, just understanding the impacts are really significant that we all understand, from hygiene, from social distancing, all these impacts that will really change the way consumers operate and behave. And I think certainly for retail, it's hugely important and a hugely affected sector. for them to really understand in detail, obviously how they need to reconfigure their stores now. We're talking about, limits of people going into shops as we start to open up. So down from those simple things. And then I think my response would be to understand how technology can play a part. That's the really key point. So, and talking about the cake, I was thinking one of the really great things I think we had prior to COVID-19 was a really good trajectory on digital innovation. And I think that's what we need to keep, because I think more than ever, an intensified digital response will be the answer going forward. But I think for key industries, we look at older people, I think there could be a profound and long-term impact on older people. If we don't have a virus, the mitigation strategies will potentially really affect older populations. So, that's another change around aged care and services towards older parts of the community. We're going to have to really rethink how we do things. And travel, obviously, lots of hot discussion on what it's going to mean for opening of borders. Again, if you look at the scenarios of the short, rapid return, the medium return and the long return, the impact on tourism and hospitality is just enormous. So we've already seen Virgin, going into receivership, or administration. So yeah, I think it's really starting to unpick the detail of what this means going forward and thinking about how we respond with our strategies.
That plays another response on the poll. We have a very strong response to people wanting to know whether we can still be internationally facing post-COVID. And I'll throw to you, Joe, on that first, but it really plays into the question of how long this will take and what the residual impact will be on that dreaded G word, globalisation. Joe, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I think the supply chains for many countries are broken and will stay broken, and we'll have to readjust how we do things. You take something as simple as food and food security. Not really something that Australia's really had to think about, but of course when something like this happens and the supply chains are broken, there is the potential for real issues. So I think we will rethink a lot of what we do, and it will probably sit under a resilience banner where we think about many of these topics of how the city can be more resilient going forward. Sydney was already thinking about these things anyway in response to the bushfires. On the tourism sector, it's interesting we mentioned that. Yes, it is hugely impacted, but I think we'll all explore our own countries more. And in doing so, we'll probably reconnect better with our own communities, our own heritage, etc. So we've got to find the positives within that as well. People won't stop wanting to go on holiday, but they'll just do it in a very different way. And I think people will have a sense of nationalism. The clapping that occurs every week for the NHS in the UK, for instance, that I think is very special. It's almost wartime behaviour. And I think
that's a really good point. And I think that we saw the ugly side of nationalism beginning to rise in parts of Europe and certainly in the US. And I think that this may provoke a pivot in nationalistic behaviour towards more healthy orientations, if you like. And the NHS example is a good one. I'm thinking of people in Italy singing from their balconies. I'm thinking about the way that communities and nations on the meta level respond, but it might provoke a pivot away from, if we're lucky, from extreme right-wing politics and nationalism. I may be banking too much on that, but there is a risk in that, I think, as well. And Don, do you want to talk about that? Because the politics of regionalism is one thing, but what this does to people's sense of engagement globally is another thing altogether.
Yeah, look, I think on the supply chain point of view, I think that's a really interesting one, because there's a lot of talk at the moment about manufacturing rising again and bringing work back onshore. I think we've got to be very careful about that, because I think there'll be the risk of a return to business as usual once the normal economics kick back in. So I think from Australia's point of view, we need to be very selective and very careful to make sure that we focus on trying to bring things back onshore that we can do well. So we don't want to go back to protectionism. We want to understand within value chains, where can we operate effectively? And then how can we bring that work back to Australia and build industry capability around it in a way that leverages technology and makes us sustainable into the future. So I just think on the supply chain one, that's really important. It's a really good question about how we will face outwards internationally. Huge ramifications for the international student market at the moment. And obviously so much uncertainty about when we will return back to open borders and what that will mean for us. So there's a few really, in addition to tourism, if you look at international students, huge market for the country, huge income revenue stream for the country. So I think there are a couple of really important things. One thing I think we should mention is environment. So the lack of pollution that we've got now, how great would it be to sustain that going forward somehow? And I think coming back to the point around we can actually change, we can adapt, and we can do it quickly, and we can do it at scale. We've seen it in digital health. We've seen it in other scenarios. Why can't we make a change around the environment now? Why can't this be the moment in time where we get that sustained improvement on the environment that takes us to that place that we've wanted to be for a long time?
Where do we think about this in terms of sustained improvement in our engagement with the environment, though? Because if our movement is limited and our interaction with the physical environment is limited, do we become warriors of the small space, or how does it work?
I think again, it comes back to good government in a way, and it's not just government, but last year or the year before, we had Michaelia Cash, sort of using as her argument against electric vehicles that we didn't want to take utes off tradies, just ridiculous stuff. I think we've got to hold government to account more and expect more. And because we know they can change and they can move quicker, I don't think it's just about lack of, less people moving around. It's about changing transport, changing those big drivers in renewables that just should have been happening a long time ago, to be honest. I think we've just got to expect more from government in a way.
Green recovery is not impossible, and is being talked about in many other countries around the world right now. How do we recover from this in a positive way? Green recovery is a very sensible suggestion, and it requires government to be at the heart of that, to make some really difficult policy decisions, to change a lot of regulations, to push certain industries and encourage certain industries, but it is a viable way for us to recover.
And I'll get to, there's a couple of good questions online, which we'll get to before the end of the session, but one of the responses to the poll talks about decentralising the Sydney CBD across Western Sydney as a possible response to the current circumstances. If, we've all become wonderfully adept at working from home, if that continues, if we have this situation where we can end the mass exodus via commute of Western Sydney into Sydney every day at the end of this period, is that something realistic? Can we look at potentially, executing a large-scale decentralisation of Sydney as today's attendees seem to be pushing for? Can we do that with our urban spaces and our way of working? Jo?
Yes, I think we can, and I think that's the big opportunity for Western Sydney. So probably stole your thunder for your closing remarks later, but yes, absolutely we can.
Terrific. Don, what do you think, mate?
Yeah,
Somebody that lives in what
I
they
agree.
might call a dormitory suburb, is it possible to address this question?
Yeah, it is, but I think we have to be really clever about how we do it. So for me, it's probably more an implementation issue. If we look at future housing estates, if we're going to be working from home, a couple of days a week, maybe say, it's not unrealistic. What does that mean for how we design a residential housing estate? Does that mean that we should build in micro hubs where people can go and do, work from a co-working space if they don't just want to work from their home where they have all the issues with kids, etc., but not have to travel to Sydney? Do we go back to things like urban farming within housing estates? All those sorts of issues I think are really important. But that people movement issue, if you look at the massive congestion issues we have in Western Sydney and that commute every day, and I travel to Parramatta, I can spend up to an hour and a half a day quite easily each way. There's 3 hours that I've got back, and that's part of the reason why I'm actually enjoying working from home. It's just given me back so much more. The health impacts that come from that around diabetes, heart disease, these are really big public health issues that come off the back of these, cascade off of the transport issues, and they relate to the pollution issues. So that the wins are very, very big if we can work out how to do this. We just need to be clever about how we do it.
The comment or question from Paul and Tan online, who actually says, can this pandemic be the catalyst for a new technological era in which Australia is really well positioned to excel? Is that something you would agree with, Don?
I think so. I think if you look at technology, I mean, the evidence is in, you don't have to, the change in sort of exponential thinking. If you look around the world, what's happening, I think, again, the issue we've had is, I feel like innovation has been constrained in Australia over recent years. And you look at those things around EVs, renewables, other areas, even water, I don't think we've made enough progress on water. So I think the technology is not the issue. The technology, it's more about how much support and investment and energy are we willing to put behind training people so we can create a workforce, a labour market that is highly digitally enabled. I think that's the future real challenge for us. It's the technology itself is not the problem.
Melissa McGrath raises a question for you, Don, about whether this new innovation program you're talking about based on collaboration actually accounts for IP and how that's commercialised and allocated. Is it all walking down the meadow holding hands, or is there that consideration we have to be?
Look, IP is always an issue to be considered, but I think when we get into the instance where IP ownership and protection holds us back from progress as a small firm, as a startup or an SME, that's where it becomes problematic. We at Launchpad always try to take a respectful approach to IP, but to really encourage people to share their ideas. I think you always get much more when you share, but you have to balance that with a sensible approach. If you have a very specific piece of IP, yes, you need to protect it. And where you've got a collaborative research and development process, it's just about putting in place sensible processes and management structures to manage that. But my advice with IP is get out there and share your ideas. You'll learn more than you'll actually get from hiding it.
You can always call the lawyers on the hotline if you need to, but just get it churning first. One for you, Joe, and it's a question that's come in from Willem Snell, and it's, what does the future look like for our public space? Do we, for instance, fully choose for walkable or bikeable cities to create space in our streets and keep pollution low? Could this crisis be a catalyst for better human-scale cities, contributing to the other slower crisis of climate change? Wow.
I would love to see that happen for our cities, and I think it's been too easy in the past for it to be too hard to retrofit our cities to be that way. We've got a really good opportunity now with potentially people working from home a little bit more, suburbs being more important, less commuting, to reallocate some of that space coming into the cities. But then our public spaces, not just in the city, but in those suburb areas, are going to be even more important. And I think there's a couple of phases as well. So we potentially have 18 months of the emergence phase where we all still need to socially distance. But of course, we want to be outside, we want to be doing the things that we used to do. So we will have to redesign how they work. We'll have to redesign how entrances to major buildings, public spaces work. We'll have to rethink how sporting events might occur so that we can retain some of that social distancing. I know some of my colleagues are doing a lot of microsimulation modeling at the moment to see just how much capacity we lose if we keep that social distancing. And I think we can do it cleverly as well. We can do it with better landscaping, with urban food production, with things that actually bring people together and create a better environment, and generate oxygen in our office spaces with these things, rather than just having cones or bollards and, the traditional ways of doing things. I think we will see a bit of tactical urbanism in the next few months prior to us all coming out, to put some of these ideas into play. Which inevitably will require the government to rethink some of the processes that they go through in order to be able to do these things in our public spaces. And go back to one of the earlier questions, I would like to see that as being a long-lasting change. No longer do we have 6-12 months of discussion and debate in order to change something in our cities. We're able to be much more nimble and pivot and agile to make positive change.
I agree, but is there a risk in countenancing all of those structures we need to put in place to protect social distancing? Is there a risk that we lose the spontaneity and the playfulness of cities if we have to be careful?
Yes, and I think it's inevitable that is going to happen in the short term. When we're not allowed to behave like human beings have always behaved, yes, that has an impact on us, and it's not going to feel the same. But we can put art and culture at the center of that. We can put playful spaces at the center of that. We can create places for children that still lift our hearts and still make us feel good about our urban spaces and our urban environments. It doesn't have to be a negative. And if we all know why we're doing it and it's only for an interim emergence phase, then I think we can handle that. Australia's been really, really lucky. You know, we are not as impacted as some countries around the world, and hopefully that emergence phase will be a lot less painful for us. And if we can get out quickly and be agile and create some of these environments, I think it's the sort of thing that will be copied in other parts of the world as they start to emerge. So I think we have a good opportunity here, and the positivity that I see in a lot of my colleagues, you know, full of creative ideas as to what we might do and how we might partner with different organisations with different ideas to do things that are a bit more playful and a bit more fun. I see no reason why we can't get through the next 18 months with something that actually we might want to retain after that.
There's a couple of questions I'll get to in a moment too, but for you, Don, on the question of spontaneity, that's so integral to this ecosystem that you've been striving to create around innovation through Launchpad. How do you retain spontaneity in the innovation and business space when everything's so nailed down at the moment? How do you keep the dream alive?
Yeah, well, look, I think, like I said before, it's about understanding what the durable changes to society are, I think, or even not the durable ones, but the current ones. So we understand from a business point of view how consumer spending patterns have changed, how behaviours are changing, what are the restrictions. I think we can then respond to that. So I don't think spontaneity is lost, but maybe it needs to be a little bit more managed at the moment. But just on you know, how humans are reacting, something I think is really important to note, out in the suburbs, you're seeing this huge amount of people out walking now. Nearly every day, you'll just see families out, probably because some of the parents aren't working. It's unfortunate, but you know, I just think that's a great thing. That, you know, they're the sorts of things that hopefully we can retain out of this, you know, the crisis.
That might be something that speaks to a question from Bernard Fion. G'day, Bernie, up in the mountains, probably just around the corner from me, mate. He's talked about what you might call a return to the village mentality for a period, where he's promoting co-working hubs in housing estates or in those dormitory suburbs, for want of a better word, that could fill the void and bring about rapid decentralisation for a period. Is that something, Don, you reckon's viable, and have you seen something like that begin to emerge?
Yeah, no, I think we had a really good shift towards work hubs prior to the crisis. You know, we've seen them out. Oran Park, near where I live, there's a great work hub. It was set up by Landcon and the developer of the estate. So honestly, I think they're the sorts of changes that we need to push for, because I think they're practical changes. You know, if you look at them logically, you say, why do we shift all these people into the city every day to sit in an office? It just doesn't make any sense. You know, there's no logic to it. I mean, yes, for a couple of days, go and do what you need to do for meetings, but and the uptake of Zoom, the technology we use now, it's just been so pervasive and so ubiquitous. I can't see us retreating from that, you know, very quickly.
Joe, is there a role for the work hub model here, and could it be an enhanced one where instead of the kind of 70s or 80s model of worker drones, you know, could we have a situation where we have an artist in residence, or Don, we have older people come in as mentors to address those two other issues you guys mentioned? Joe, is that something we could think about, a radical reinvention of the work hub?
Completely. I see no reason why that won't happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see very radical change. So rather than an indoor space where we sit at desks and, okay, there might be something interesting going on around you, perhaps we have some outdoor spaces as well. They will feel healthier for the next 18 months and they reconnect us back to nature. Something that we know we've been trying to do in our cities for many, many years. You know, so if we are going to stay in our suburbs, let's make the best use of those public spaces. So I think we'll see a real reinvention of what these mean. You know, the times that we work have even changed. You know, no longer do we sit at an office desk for 7-8 hours a day. We are working split shifts. We're dealing with our children. We're making the most of it and having lunch with them or going for walks, like you say, in the suburbs. Perhaps people will no longer think about Monday to Friday as the working week. We might do less hours and spend more time at the weekend, so that these blurring of the lines of what is the future of work are about to change radically, I think, and that they'll be driven by what people have enjoyed right now.
I think there's a really big role for councils here, for local government. And it'd be really interesting to see what comes out of local government in the response, because I think so many of these sorts of activities and support structures need to be implemented by local governments, and they can really help the way that their local communities operate and change. So I think we don't just want to focus on federal and state governments, we do need to be looking to local as well.
That's the trap, isn't it? That it becomes a big meta-crisis response, and we have stimulus dialogue at the federal and state level, which is critically important, but not that grassroots level. I want to just turn to a question from our own Peter Hutchings. He's talked about this notion of decentralisation, which we've had a really positive response about. But he's just mentioned those particular sectors of the employment sector that are perhaps lower paid in the main, so hospital workers, food, cleaning, deliveries and so forth, who really can't take part in that mobility and decentralisation exercise, those that are forced to commute into essential roles. How do we ensure that these positive benefits like work hubs, like regionalism, like decentralisation, like online working and learning, how do we ensure that we don't leave those others behind? And that's a question that I noticed Helen O'Loughlin on the line has been championing as well of late. How do we ensure that we don't leave those people behind?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, if I'm honest, but I think if we are creating a future in our cities that is positive and is equitable, then everybody benefits. And I think we may well see, for instance, space being given over to more residential in the city centre. Perhaps we'll find that housing is more affordable as a result. If people are spread across the city rather than densified into the city centre, then everybody is pushing for the entire city to be improved, and that can only be better for some of the outlying areas of Sydney.
Yeah, I think, Andy, it's important to note we don't have the answers to a lot of these issues. And I think that's part of our challenge now, is to really think about the structures and the processes we need to help innovate and to help understand and analyse where do we need to go with lots of these. Like Joe said, we don't have the answers necessarily.
I don't think we need to, but I think it might be a question that, as I mentioned at the outset, we adopt a set of principles, one of which could be that whatever changes we institute or retain in this cake mix, for want of a better word, post-COVID, that one of the principles is, for example, that we don't leave those less mobile workers or less digitally connected people behind. That's a principle that came through CatalystWest, but I think that needs to guide our thinking across the board.
I agree with that, and I recall leave no one behind being the phrase that came out of CatalystWest last time. I really liked it. And going back to something I said earlier about kindness and the sort of kindness we're seeing in society, you put those two things together and suddenly you've got a very different way of operating. And if that permeates through government and through decisions on investment and decisions on how stimulus money is spent, then clearly we will get the right outcomes.
I think that's a real
think, mate, to return to your point about the role for councils, is that a space they can occupy when the other levels of government are concerned with large-scale stimulus and policy shifts? Is it the gap that's opening up for local councils to walk into, that more community-level obvious connection?
I think so. And I think it's already happening. I mean, I don't have a lot of insight into but I've heard little bits and pieces about what's happening in councils. And it sounds like there's some actually really good innovative ideas. I mean, thinking about public spaces, thinking about how we better leverage technology, how we can change home working practices, how we change local regulation, in particular around retail. I think there's going to be huge implications for how retail bounces back going forward or bounces forward. So yeah, I think there's a real role, and I think, CatalystWest, really everything we were pushing in CatalystWest, it just feels like it's just on steroids now. It's just ever more important now that we keep that work going and we just intensify it.
We're ahead of the curve, people. Eh? Listen, I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want us to get to all of these questions that are coming through online. And thank you everybody for responding to the poll. We're going to take those responses away and I'll talk to them a little bit later on in this session as we wind up. We have a question that's come through from Edward Forrester, which is about the natural resistance that we're going to have post-COVID to using public transport. And if we're talking about a green recovery, how are we going to overcome those types of behavioural resistance to things that are integral to an environmentally led recovery?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I think it gets into an interesting area around immune response, to be honest, across the community, and things like immune certification. So are we going to get to the place where we have to carry a card that says we now have immunity to COVID? I don't know. Will you get to a point where you can't get onto a flight or into an airport until you've had a rapid test that shows you've either got antibodies or you haven't got the virus? I actually think there's some things that probably sound a bit untenable now are probably where we're headed. Because, and, you know, I mean, obviously no one has a crystal ball around the vaccine, but from if you take a risk mitigation point of view perspective on it, I think we should actually be planning for not having a vaccine. So, and what will that look like? But I think there's some pretty interesting things coming down the line.
Jo, what do you think?
It's a very difficult one because there's no singular answer, I don't think. We will have resistance to public transport. And that's one of the reasons that places like Milan are putting in 30, 40 kilometres of cycle lanes to give people an alternative and to try and encourage a change in behaviour as a result of it. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that we will socially distance on trains and buses because the capacity will be so low that really it makes them rather useless. I think we will be expected to wear masks and to keep as distant as we can. I think that there may well be train stations that are metered at entry, so we might find that there's large queues outside. But that in itself will encourage more working from home, will encourage more peak spreading. I think that we'll end up with offices that have shifts, so we'll all come and leave at different times that are allotted to us in order to try and reduce that load on public transport. The worst thing we can do is allow people to get back in their cars.
All of the things that we thought were impossible only weeks and months ago. I want to talk about a couple of questions that have come in now on supply chain, but from pretty different angles. Helen O'Loughlin makes a great point about how we can work towards more localised supply chain solutions around food and urban farming. Which I think Jo might speak to some of the solutions you talked about earlier in an office context. I think this is about us all growing, cabbages at home. And I think that in some respects, she talks very importantly about Aboriginal leadership and guidance in pharmaceutical and urbanised food production as well. So maybe that's a way we can close some of the supply chain links in the area of food. I'll throw to you firstly on that one, Jo, and then I've got a manufacturing question for you, Don.
Okay. So the office environment that we mentioned earlier before the call, we've done some modelling to look at how pathogens move through air conditioning systems and in office environments and in buildings. And there are places within buildings where you may be more likely to pick up the virus than other places in buildings as a result of the way the pathogens move. So when we all move back into these places, there will be spaces that we simply won't want to occupy. And in those spaces, why wouldn't we put urban food systems? Why wouldn't we use urban food systems in our public spaces as part of the tactical urbanism? And I think that there is an opportunity for us to begin to change with what previously might have been seen as a fringe idea, but actually make this idea something that becomes the norm going forward.
It's like the good life. We're going back to the 70s.
Yeah.
I have to dust off my permaculture books. So I think that's a fantastic response. We're seeing sort of some tactical urbanism in that farming and food production space occurring as well. I want to draw you, Don, to a question from Lance Chair, who talks about how some of those gaps in our manufacturing capability have been exposed, particularly in Western Sydney, given we do so much of it out here. What's manufacturing going to look like in our region in the future? Don?
Well, I mean, we've had a lot of discussions for a long time now about the digital transformation of Western Sydney's manufacturing industry. I think it's very pocketed how far we've progressed with that, but I think that is the future and that is the answer. And like I talked about before, when we talk about bringing things back to Australia, production back, we've got to do it where it makes sense, and we've got to build that sort of capability. So I think we just have to really understand what is the potential for the industry. We've got 8,000 manufacturing companies in Western Sydney. We're not going to transform all of those, but I think there hasn't been enough. Look, one of the risks I think we have from the state government is an over focus on the Aerotropolis, dare I say that, because if we look at what we're trying to create in the Aerotropolis and 200,000 jobs, it's very aspirational, it's very good, and I'm sure it will deliver great results. I think the risk we run is ignoring everything else that we already have. So we have around $13 billion a year of activity in the existing advanced manufacturing industry in Western Sydney. Really interesting things happening in less, interesting things, maybe like furniture and places like that, electronic components. There's really good stuff out there. And I think it's about understanding what we've got and building on that. And I think from a job creation point of view, it actually potentially becomes a much easier challenge when you want to add 1 or 2 or 5 jobs to a company because they've developed new capability than to have to start a new company or to pivot a new company into into aerospace and defence. So I think we need, to be honest, I think we need a bit of a stand back look at where we're at. But in general, the path for me, it is towards Industry 4.0, building cyber physical system capability. And what is the labour market? What is the the training, the reskilling, the upskilling requirements involved in achieving that? But the future is digital.
One of the things that plays into that space, Joe, and I might ask you to talk about this, is in response to the poll question, what topic would you most like to see us cover in future Catalyst West conversations? One of the leading responses is how the creative sector can lead COVID-19 recovery. Can you talk to us, Joe, a little bit about the role that the creative sector might play in our cities and urban spaces in recovery?
So by creative sector, I read arts and culture, and we all know that the arts and culture sector is suffering incredibly right now. But there are pockets of innovation going on where some of the smaller firms have gone online and are actually using the data from their online operations to understand better their audiences. So emerging from this, they will have better information about who their audiences are and how they might be able to reach them. And I think using some of our urban environments, particularly the outdoor urban environments, changing regulations, making sure that we can use small spaces and that we can use them without months of permissions being required, will really assist the arts and culture sector. I also think that if we do end up with an environment where people are changing their working patterns, the evening and the nighttime environment in many urban spaces and suburban areas will be very different as well. So the potential for evening activity will grow in that emergence phase.
I think, Andy, this is another place that government might have missed a trick, to be honest, in where we looked at the short courses that are targeted at retraining displaced workers, and they've really focused heavily on health and some other areas. I think there's a huge opportunity in entrepreneurship training. If we look at these people that are displaced at the moment, a lot of these people work in industries where they have to generate their own work. They have to be very entrepreneurial, very creative. I think there's a real opportunity to take lots of those people now, put them into some short course entrepreneurship training, and then be putting them back into the workforce in 6-12 months' time with a greatly increased skill set to be able to operate more as entrepreneurs. And that'll happen for people that run their own companies and for people that work inside small and large firms as well. So I think they should really be looking at short course training around entrepreneurship at the moment.
Yeah, and really those two sectors have so much interplay. I think arts and culture and that kind of entrepreneurial mindset, they both come from that creative space and can be essential in this period going forward. We're going to wrap up in a moment. I want to walk through some of the responses to the polling, but while I do that and trawl through those, Joe and Don, if you could give me a snapshot of your thoughts on the role for non-government organisations in this period. It seems to me that the onus is on organisations like ARUP, like Western Sydney University, to really step up at this time. But what is it exactly that we should be doing? Joe, you first.
So our app's a little bit different because we don't have shareholders. So we every year have a research fund that staff can access to undertake pieces of research. And we've refocused that research fund this year to face COVID-19. So internally, our staff are being asked to think of ideas of things that we can support in order to generate positive change going forward. We're very focused on things like the UN SDGs, making a difference generally from an environmental perspective. So for us, doing things that nudge that behavior and show how things can be done differently, finding those partnerships, supporting SMEs, doing those things that we know need to be done for good recovery are very much a focus for us.
Yeah, I think, Andy, definitely around collaboration. I think the role for industry and academia in particular is to really work together even more than before. And I think part of that is in some ways putting pressure on government so that we do get this better government going forward. But also just to show a leadership in terms of, and thought leadership, really understanding what the changes are, what the impacts will be, how do we find the solutions to take us through this period, and from the economy point of view in particular, how do we make this recovery as, reduce the pain as much as possible. So I think there's a real leadership role, and I think an acceptance of change as well is really important. And for some of the people within organisations that have resisted change, I think there's probably some shocks coming in the future. So I think we're going to need some more progressive and dare I say it, some more radical thinking in these sorts of organisations, really around this issue of let's understand what the durable changes are and how we can best respond and how we can show leadership in that area.
I think it's been the great democratisation of change, because organisational change is, when it's used in the corporate sense, is often used only to apply to a particular section of an organisation, usually the lowest paid, lowest and most exposed. But everybody has been saturated in the urgency of change in recent weeks. And thank you both for responding today and stepping up to the plate and doing all of that reimagining on what Western Sydney might look like. I've shared the polling results with everyone online here today, and we'll consolidate those and get them out to you after today's webinar. I can't let the response to question 5 go without commenting though, which was, which lockdown quote best applies to you? Don and Joe, I'll ask you for your responses in a moment. But the top response was, I'm in an endless Zoom vortex. Nearly 60% of you said that describes you. Here's another one. I've discovered a meal between brunch and lunch. Okay, 19% tick that box. What time does the bar open? That's probably my one. 13%. Come on, people. And day 21, toilet paper is the least of my worries. Only 6% now the toilet paper block has passed. And the lowest response, homeschooling starts at 9 a.m. and finishes at 9:15 a.m. I could tick all of those boxes. Don and Joe, which one most applies to you?
I'm with you. At what time does the bar open?
Don.
I think I'm on the homeschooling one, to be honest. I feel very guilty at the moment about my efforts around the whole homeschooling issue, but yeah. We'll work on that.
Yeah, all of us with kids have just, as if we needed to, we've just gained an even more heightened respect for teachers. If ever there was an essential worker, they're one of them. We're going to close off today's session, and please join me in thanking Joanne and Don, and I can hear your round of applause out there over the line. Thanks so much, guys, and we're going to do more of this, and hopefully we'll engage with both of you again soon. Before we finish up, I want to thank all of you online who participated today. We're getting great feedback, and we're having really great support for this event. And the principle of not leaving anybody behind when it comes to any CatalystWest supported event is ringing true. So thank you so much. Next week, I'm very excited to say that Helen Bartram is returning to host. So you won't see me for a couple of weeks, a big sigh of relief for many of you. And Helen's bringing a very, very special guest, our CatalystWest MC for last year, Jan Fran. So you'll have a wonderful conversation between Helen and Jan on how social life, if you like, has been changed as a result of the current circumstances. I don't imagine I have the first idea of the subject matter they'll engage in, but I can assure you it'll be Western Sydney focused and it'll be fun. So please join in. You'll get an invite to that shortly. Thank you again to Joe and Don. Thanks, guys. And see you next week, 2 o'clock. Same bat channel, same bat station. See you guys.